This is the Brain, and you're listening to the GeekCast radio network. Yes!
Hello and welcome to episode 189 of the Cinema Geeks. I am one of your Cinema Geeks OptimusSolo, and joining me for today's record is MovieRevolt Dan. Hello.
Hello.
And returning special guest, Mr. Matthew Stewart. Hello.
Hello. I'm like the guest that won't ever leave.
I paused for dramatic effect because I knew you would say something clever.
Don't give me that much credit.
So we are the three amigos today. We are going to be continuing our series looking back on last decade's worth of movies. We've already done a few of these lists when it came to top 10 science fiction films and animated films, superhero films. Now we are going on to another genre, and today we're going to be talking about comedy because, hey, at this time of the year, and just in general in 2020, I think we need to laugh at times because otherwise we'll just spend most of our year crying, I think. So it's a good time to talk about comedies, and then hopefully we can right the ship here next week and not have as many bad things to talk about after Tuesday. But anywho, Dan, how's it been? A long time no talk.
Oh, same old. Yeah. World pandemic, the world's on fire, all that good stuff. But
right.
Hey, movies still exist, kind of, in a new format. So,
have either of you guys been to a theater?
I have not. No, not at all.
No, the last time I went to the theater was when I went to see Bad Boys 3 and had to leave early because my kid was sick at daycare. So,
oh, gotcha. Yeah, I know our local theater has started offering, like, you can just spend like $100 and you can rent out the whole theater. That way you can control who's there and the social distancing and everything of that. So I guess whatever, you get 10 friends together and each throw in $10 and you have the whole theater to yourself. But I don't know. With the baby, we don't have a chance to experiment with that, or I don't know if we would anyways, but that's probably about the only way I would go at the moment. But that's just because I'm trying to keep the 4-month-old healthy and safe. So, but at least they're trying to get clever, I guess, if they can survive all this. But either way, I've tried to catch up with a few things on Netflix and Amazon Prime and things of that nature. But I guess that's how we watch new movies these days, and we'll see if it forever changes the game or if it ever kind of goes back a little bit and swings to the other side with the pendulum a little bit. But regardless of how that goes, we're here to talk about comedies, so we will do that. How we're going to do that, we're going to just kind of go 10 through 1. We're going to rotate around. And then at the end, we'll talk real quickly about any, honorable mentions or things of that nature. So, Dan, anything that you want to preface your list with, or anything that you want to talk about as far as coming up with your list? How did this compare to the task when we were using other genres? I find comedy a little bit harder.
Yeah, I agree, because I think there's a lot of comedies that kind of blend. Like, is that a comedy? Is it more of a drama? The dramedy type of area. There's just straight up comedy. So I try to, similar when we did the halfway year list, stick to the same idea of just going with movies that are comedy first for the most part. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of those films that are really, really funny, but hey, despite what the Golden Globes things, The Martian is not on my list. I think that's a great movie, but I don't necessarily think it's necessarily a comedy per se. It has comedic moments and it's important to the overall sense of that film, but when I think The Martian, it's not a comedic movie in my eyes.
No.
So that does make it kind of hard, obviously. So and there are some films that maybe that did end up making my list where you could argue maybe they aren't true comedies. I don't know, but I do feel much better about the end of the decade list than I did the half decade list, because I think maybe it was a little bit stronger when it came to comedy overall as we finished out the decade.
Matt, how about you? You've done a couple of these lists with us. Was this one harder or easier for you to come up with?
Yeah, this one was a little bit kind of harder because it's to Dan's point, it's more of a broad subject matter, because you could have comedies or you can have movies that have jokes that you can laugh at, but I wouldn't necessarily call them a comedy. Like one film, and I don't know if this was on any of your guys' lists. I think about like The Wolf of Wall Street, where technically, depending on what list you're going off of or whose opinion you're listening to, it would say that movie is a comedy. Is it true that that movie has a lot of very funny comedic moments? Yes, but in the 3-hour runtime, I'm not sure I would call it a true comedy or anything. So it became kind of the genres blended and everything. Is it a comedy? Is it a dramedy? Is it a drama that just has comedic moments? So this was definitely a lot harder than doing a straight up sci-fi film
Right.
or a comic book film because you have pretty clear guidelines. Whereas where something like this is such a gray area where people might say, "Well, that was so funny, it has to be a comedy." It's like, well,
Right.
yeah, I think it should make for some very interesting debating on what we think is a comedy, what constitutes it as a comedy, or just as a film that happens to have some funny moments in it.
Yeah, I feel like animated is on one end of the spectrum where it's very
Yeah.
easy to distinguish, and then we're on
Mhm.
the opposite end with comedy. The other thing that's different about comedies for me is, I don't know, it's a genre where, yes, there are comedies that have stood the test of time, and there are comedies that have been funny for decades.
Mhm.
There's also a whole lot of comedies that are funny in the moment that do not kind of last. You know what I mean? Like you watch them again like 10 years later and you're like, that was not as funny as it was when I was 13 or whatever. You know what I mean? Or whatever it was that, like, I feel like, what makes something funny changes so much more than what makes something dramatic or what makes something action. You know what I mean? Those like elements
Mhm.
stick. But with comedy, it's so subjective that I feel like, man, every time you revisit it, you can have a different opinion because some stuff just stays funny and some stuff doesn't. For me, like, I can go back and watch, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and Princess Bride, and anything that Bill Murray was in the 80s and early 90s, and it's going to be funny to me still. But like some of the stuff I watched, like, I don't know, I think of like the Jim Carrey era, I guess, in the 90s. Like, some of that is still funny and some of it's just hasn't held up well. I don't know if you guys agree with that or not, Dan.
I think too, a lot of that is just what you find funny as a kid, or at a certain age you
Mhm.
may not find funny later as an adult. Although it was interesting as I went back, because we're doing this, I'm like, I don't even remember what I had on my half decade list. And as I was going back, I'm like, I forgot that movie even existed. Like, I had this Danish film Clown, which is a movie I enjoy, but like I forgot all about that. I'm like, I had that on my list. And Alan Partridge, which is another good movie, and I again forgot all about that film. So it was interesting for some reason. A lot of the community films didn't stick out to me as much as some of the other genres, but yeah, I do agree. Some things don't, especially when you have a lot of comedies that maybe are directed toward a certain time period. I think it's even more true with television. A lot of references to like what's going on at that current state, or even like spoof comedies that are spoofing what's popular at the moment. I mean, you have something like Airplane that's a little bit timeless, but then you have some that are not nearly as effective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like a haunted house or something like that.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah,
oh
yeah.
yeah, there's that movie exists. Plus, I mean, I think what's interesting about going through like is I grabbed my list primarily from based on Dan's recommendation, which it was an untapped resource, it was a letterbox.
Mhm.
And there had to have been between the decade from 2010 to 2019, I would be there was like 8,740 something movies that were like, I guess, under the label of comedy, but they could have been comedy drama, comedy animated, comedy this, comedy that. So they just had the label comedy in them. So
Hmm.
imagine going through, but they also included, let's say, comedy specials or, like stand up comedy or something like that too, or, anything that could have just been released. So just the magnitude of things that are listed as quote unquote comedy was a little flabbergasting to me. But it's also usually pretty cheap stuff to make as well. So why not just keep pumping out comedies, whether they're good or bad? But I think we're hopefully going to get down to the bottom of this, though, in this list.
Absolutely. So, Matt, you are the special guest, the honored guest. So we will let you go first, and then I'll jump off of that and let Dan round up with his picks after that. So, Matt, what do you have at number 10? And just as a forewarning, when I get to my list, I am cheating all over the place. So you're just gonna have to bear with me on that one. But Matt, what's your number 10 pick?
All right, so number 10 pick, and this is the about second or third most recent film on the list too. So it's from 2017, and I was just really looking for things that I found really funny, and I think as um, a something that helped make this movie funnier was after watching it after reading the book, and it's going to be the 2017 The Disaster Artist with the Franco brothers and a very interesting cast. The same, like, Judd Apatow group that you always see in every Judd Apatow. And fair warning, there's going to be a lot of Judd Apatow on my list. just fair warning for everybody. So Disaster Artist is, it's funny. It's weird. The book really helps kind of bring it alive as well, too. And I think Dave Franco and James Franco, as much as people definitely have it, they take issue with Dave Franco. Not Dave Franco. Everybody likes Dave Franco. People don't really like James Franco. I get that confused sometimes. But his take of Tommy Wiseau and it being it's a comedy in the way that it's really goofy and silly because it's sometimes the fact is stranger than fiction most of the time too. But I think The Disaster Artist is just a really fun movie. The way they started with kind of these video testimonials, and it goes into the story of this very oddball character that people still don't really know what to make of, even to these days, even though he's become kind of a mythic folk hero, is a good deal of fun. And Dave Franco, like I keep saying, is excellent in this movie. I think he does a great job. And it's a funny, weird, quirky movie that looks at a very weird, quirky, unintentionally funny movie as well too, which I think is as meta as it gets.
It's actually a blind spot for me. I've seen The Room multiple times. And
wow, okay. Multiple times.
Yeah, multiple times. It was a thing that we would watch at our crappy movie nights with Mr. Fiddly Cent and a couple other people here at the house. And, so I'm familiar with The Room, and this was definitely high on my radar, the year it came out back in, I think you said 2017 or so. And somehow it just snuck by and I never got a chance to watch it. So I think it was because most of the time the people that I was around hadn't seen The Room. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want them to watch this without seeing that. And then I just never got around to showing them The Room. So it's still on my list of things I need to watch, but I can't speak to it. But I'm sure it is funny because it's got funny material to be based off of. So I definitely can see why it would work like that. Dan, have you seen this one?
I have, yeah. And I thought it actually did a pretty good job, too, of like making Tommy Wiseau into like a complete person. I was kind of concerned about that because you do wonder... It's such a weird situation. It's like, is it an act? Is he what is actually going on there? And I don't think I think it really rides that line of trying to figure that out. But it's not making fun of him, which was my kind of one of my bigger concerns. Is this just going to be mocking him? And because I feel like that would be kind of mean spirited. But I don't think it was. I think it certainly showed his flaws. But ultimately, I thought it was again really funny. And Franco's much more range of an actor than I realized in that part. So,
all right. So good start here for number 10 with you on with The Disaster Artist. For my number 10, this is going to be kind of like my section for my personal. Just for some reason, I love this movie a lot. I've shown this to everybody that I watch movies with basically at least once. And it just works for me on so many levels. And that is Crazy Stupid Love. From 2011, right at the beginning of the decade there. This one's the one with Steve Carell, Ryan Gosling, Emma Stone, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people in this one. Even Kevin Bacon makes an appearance, of course. But I don't know. I just think the combination of Carell and Ryan Gosling acting off of each other is just so perfect. And we've all seen guys that represent both of those characters in that movie, and I just think the transformation he tries to put Steve Carell into and kind of all the twists and turns, it goes a little bit off the rails, I think, in the last 30 minutes or so, maybe 40 minutes, where it becomes a little bit too neat and tied up with a bow type thing. But I just love the interactions that Ryan Gosling and Carell have, and it has me in stitches every time. So I am a big fan of Crazy Stupid Love, and that is why it is at my number 10. Dan?
Interesting, because I don't know if you remember, but that was your number 1 at the half-decade list. So
I have no idea what was on my half-decade list. Yeah. So it fell mildly. I was trying to be more objective.
Yeah. It was yours, and Barry from True Romance was on that episode as well. That was his number 1 as well. So
nice. Well, I'm glad I at least kept it on the list then.
Yeah. For my number 10, I'm going with the 2017 film, and I guess you could say this is a little bit more subjective than the others, but I did want to include one that was more family friendly type of comedy, because I feel like that's a really hard thing to do well. And as you've seen many failures at it, just yesterday for Halloween, I watched the Haunted Mansion with Eddie Murphy, and that's a good example of how not to do family comedy, because there's seen so many bad family comedy films. But one I think that did it fantastically was Paddington 2 from 2017, which was such a better film than it had any reason of being. The first film was good; it was okay, but Paddington 2, I think, just the craftsmanship in that was like, like a Wes Anderson film meshed with like the best Looney Tunes, but more of a dry British humor within there. The performances in there are great. Hugh Grant is fantastic, and I think the reason why like this works compared to like other family films that don't necessarily work to that level is because it has a respect for the audience a bit. I think all the actors are kind of buying in and kind of know the tone of what they're doing. And there's, I think, even if it's this movie about a bear, there's a little bit of level of sophistication in it, and in the sense of like the way it's approaching things. And it's just also fun to see Brendan Gleeson as a making friends with a bear in jail. So there's all that, and there's actually some really well crafted like action set pieces that have comedic moments as well. Really good like gag type of comedy. So I went with that with my number 10, Paddington 2.
That is still a blind spot for me as well. I have seen bits and pieces of the first one, but I haven't been able to sit down and watch both of them and give them kind of a fair shake. I was a big fan of the original, the BBC series of Paddington when I was a kid. So I am looking forward to eventually watching that, which I'm sure I will now with the kid eventually. And I've only heard great things from just about everybody except for one person. So everybody else I've heard really good things about Paddington too. So I am not surprised that this shows up, and I didn't realize it was as funny, I guess, as it is. Then if you're saying that, I didn't know kind of what they went for in that one.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a comedy. It's I'm trying to think of something along like the family fun adventure type of film. I don't know. I guess you could argue it's not like just comedy, but I definitely think it is. It's certainly, I think, designed to be a good time and be enjoyable.
Nice.
It's not by any means like a serious drama or anything like that. Like classic old like Disney films of like the Mary Poppins era and things like that.
Right. So, Matt, have you seen this one?
No, I haven't. The one or two. Actually, both your picks for number 10 are both blind spots for me. Crazy Stupid Love is still something I haven't seen. My wife loves it. I don't know if it's something I'm just like crossing my arms like I don't know about this.
Give it a shot.
These guys are too goddamn charming, and I'm just freaking schlub that I'll never be as charming as anybody in this film. But I like all the people involved in the film. Just never got around to it. And Paddington 2's been I don't know. Maybe is it the fact that I really don't have a family that I'm just cold and dead inside that I don't want to watch Paddington 2 or something like that. But it's never. It seems to be such a polarizing series of films too, where people are like, "This is complete and utter trash," or it's like, "Oh, it's so heartwarming. It's a story of a bear that eats marmalade sandwiches." And
it is super earnest, so I could see why like some people may not click with that because of it's not not to the level of like the Wiggles, but it's certainly like a few degrees away from that. So I could see for some people be like, it's a little much. I need I need a little bit more cynicism in my movies. It's
a funny thing. It's like earnest. It's like I would never like tie the word earnest with like, oh, a story about a unbelievably British sounding bear who gets in crazy adventures. And I guess people are just like, this should not be taken seriously at all. You people are taking this way too serious or something. So I don't know. I'll check it out at some point. But it's funny to hear how much Dan you really enjoy it, and other people are just like
yeah. Again, part of me too is like is making my list, trying to keep it well rounded, thinking of like what is like a good example of. I thought about, not to take anyone else's. There's some other ones that I thought about putting on a list, but I felt like that type of comedy was already kind of touched upon with my list. So I figured what's a little bit that's out of the box compared to everything else, and Paddington 2 really stood out.
There we go. All right, Matt, what is your number 9?
All right, going back in time, going back to potentially something you guys put in your maybe best of the half decade list or something. But this is this is my guilty pleasure movie, I think, out of the entire list, and it's something I still watch pretty incessantly with the wife because we just enjoy it. It's something that we can. It's pure just fluff and trash, and but we love pure fluff and trash and just really weird stuff at the same time. So I'm going with 2012, and I'm going with Pitch Perfect, one of my favorite films about a cappella singing in college. And yeah, it's way better than it's kind of a shame because I feel like the other two sequels really sullied what the first one was kind of about. It was very just kind of weird look into, it felt like this the subculture of acapella at the time, I think, was like so big for so many people. You had, you know, what's the big acapella group? I can't even think of what their names are right now, but they're world renowned. But
Oh yeah, I know Pentatonics or whatever.
pentatonics and stuff like that. People love the pentatonics, and I feel like acapella was this huge thing with, I don't know, America's Got Talent and all these other talent shows. It was just like we can make music with our mouth, but it's not singing; it's guitars and everything else. And I think people don't go back to the first one as much. Pardon me, as much now because they really got a huge bad taste in their mouth after the third one, especially. But it's a fun, stupid movie. I think Anna Kendrick is charming and emo and like the dream girl I would have wanted in college anyway too. So maybe that's something for me as well. This is something I got to work out on my own head right there. But it's got enough quotable weirdness in it, and all the actors in it are very funny, and there's a lot of inside kind of weird jokes. And I'm sure if you're an acapella person, you either love this movie or hate this movie. Who knows? I don't know if you're.
I'm somewhat into acapella. I was at least in college, big time, and so I loved this movie. For some reason, it wasn't even on my radar though when I was making this list. I don't know why. I didn't think about this one. Maybe it's because I hold a grudge that this movie came out after my college years, and I wish it would have came out like when I was in high school or middle school.
Could have been a rock star.
No, I don't. Not that. I never got the pleasure of trying to do like a riff off with somebody. So you know what I mean. Like that seems like that scene right there is my favorite scene in any of out of the whole three movies. Like when they're doing those riff offs in the big groups or whatever. Like it's crazy. And Anna Kendrick is very, like you said, charming and you get drawn into her character in this movie. So I think that's pretty cool. I love this movie, so I'm not going to say anything bad about it. But for some reason, I just didn't think about it when it came to comedy because that kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, I guess. Like for me, maybe the music part took over where I just think of it in a different way. I don't know, but it is funny. It does have funny parts, so I get why it's there. Dan, any thoughts on Pitch Perfect?
Yeah, I mean, it's like similar to Matt. My wife and I think we saw every one in theaters. I could, I know at least the first two, maybe not the third one. But yeah, they're good, and my wife had the soundtrack, so I listened to many of the songs, especially Cups. I remember listening to that a lot, and it was kind of like Anna Kendrick's breakout. And yeah, it's again like it's. And the love of Breakfast Club that's in that too. I certainly like to kind of tie in all the different comedies. So
I think that's why my wife doesn't like it as much as I do because she still refuses to watch the Breakfast Club. So
I do think you get to a certain point with the Breakfast Club that you've already seen it. If you haven't, just because it gets so referenced so much, it kind of loses all of its magic.
I still wanted to see it though. At one point, I'm going to win that battle. Anyways, my number 9 is my first cheat of the countdown. I'm going to have 2 of them. I can't separate these two. I'll pick one, but for me, I was with 2011 with my number 10 pick. I'm gonna go to 2012, just 1 year later, and I will go with Moonrise Kingdom. But this is also the placeholder for Grand Budapest Hotel because I wasn't gonna put both of them on my list. So I'll say it's Moonrise Kingdom, just to be fair and not put both of them in this spot. But I mean, how can we not have Wes Anderson represented in this list? He is a funny guy. I guess it's the same type of thing, though, with some people, like it either clicks with you or it doesn't. But it really clicks with me. I mean, give me a movie that has freaking Bill Murray, Tilda Swinton, Edward Norton, Bruce Willis. I mean, I could go on and on. But like this movie cracked me up. This is, I think... because I think I was late to the party with Wes Anderson because I hadn't seen Royal Tenenbaums. I hadn't seen. I tried to watch Life Aquatic once upon a time and gave up. And there was some other things before that I'm just spacing on. And I think Moonrise Kingdom was the first one that kind of like turned me on to Wes Anderson, and then I went back and rewatched stuff, and obviously saw Grand Budapest, et cetera, that is all the stuff that's come out since. And I'm a big fan of him as a director, but I think I would credit Moonrise Kingdom as the one that kind of turned me on to him as a director. So I just think this is funny. Maybe not for everybody, but I think it's certainly deserving to be represented in a list if we're looking at the comedies of the decade. So that's what I'm going with my number 9. Dan, you're next.
Very nice. I would just say that I will also represent later on my list.
Excellent.
So my number 9, it was funny because you're talking about the cheat and you mentioned 2012. I'm like, oh, I wonder we're going to have the same number 9, but we're not. Because my number 9 is also from 2012. It's more of a straightforward comedy, one of the most straightforward comedies on my list, and might be other people's list. It was on a lot of our lists for the half decade list, and that's 21 Jump Street. Also talking about a movie that was much better than it had any business being. I remember this being announced, thinking they're going to do a movie based off 21 Jump Street with Channing Tatum and Jonah Hill. Like, how's that going to work? It ended up being really funny, especially just the way it kind of took on, speaking of comedy, taking on like what's happening at the moment. It's very taking on how much culture has changed within the high school landscape, like with, the 2010s compared to like the 90s and 80s, and how like the jock, kind of stereotypical guy is not necessarily the cool person anymore, and how Jonah Hill and Channing Tatum kind of had to change roles. And I enjoyed 22 Jump Street as well, but I just felt 21 Jump Street was a little bit more fresh. It had that big surprise factor as well, and Tatum and Hill, I think, do make a good tandem with their sense of humor. So yeah, I haven't seen it in a few years, so talking about it, I don't know if comedies hold up well, but I did really enjoy it then, and I do feel like at the core it'll still hold up with years to come. So
this is one of the ones that was one of my biggest surprises, I think, right around that time period, was because we were getting lots of kind of rehashes of older stuff with, like, I don't know, we had the new Hawaii Five-0 series, we had the Miami Vice movie, we had Charlie Angels get rebooted multiple times, and this kind of came out, I feel like, in that same era, and I was like, whatever, 21 Jump Street, I don't really remember watching that as a kid, like I'm not that interested in it, and then went and watched it and was like so entertained, and so it was so humorous, that I agree. I think it was an instant hit when it came to a comedy that I wasn't expecting coming. I have this one slotted in right now at number 12. When I was trying to make my list, it was really fighting for that 10th spot with Crazy Stupid Love and one other movie. So it just missed out. So I'm definitely in agreement that 21 Jump Street is worthy of being added into the discussion. Matt, have you seen this one?
Oh, yeah. I've seen this. I watched this probably about 3 months ago. So this is something I kind of go back to the well on. And 22 Jump Street, while funny, is, dare I say, the inferior sequel, but it is. I mean, just because 21 Jump Street, to Dan's point also, was this movie had no business being as funny or as good or as entertaining as it should have been, just a generic piece of garbage remake of something that had no business in so many reasons getting remade. But you had enough of the people, I guess, who remembered the show from the 80s, and you get all those callbacks and those little kind of winks and nods, especially with a couple of the cameos at the very end of the movie, which I think still make me laugh quite a bit. And Channing Tatum and Jonah Hill work really, really well together, and everything in this movie, even Ice Cube, who sometimes can be a little like nails on the chalkboard for me sometimes with the way he acts, but he's even entertaining in this. It's a good throwback buddy cop action flick that is way better than, again, it should have been at all. So I have this in my list. We're just not there yet. So
Gotcha. Yeah, this is. I looked at a bunch of lists from around the internet when we were making this list. Different websites and geeky outlets that have put out their own list of best comedies of the decade, and 21 Jump Street was very well represented. I think it was on every list but 2. I think I looked at about almost 10 lists, and it was on all of them but 2. It was all the way up at number 2 for Slash Film and number 3 for Paste. So a lot of people in agreement with 21 Jump Street. Matt, what is your number 8?
Number 8. So this will be the first appearance by one specific actor. I'm sure you guys will probably be able to guess, but by the time I name this actor or name the film at least. But this is another movie that it kind of falls in the same realm as 21 Jump Street, where it shouldn't have been very good. It should have been a throwaway, stupid comedy, but it actually ends up being really funny. And again, this is another film I just watched maybe about 5 or 6 months ago as well. Quarantine has given me a lot of time to just watch everything over again completely. So, but I'm going to 2014. I'm going with the movie Neighbors with Seth Rogen and Rose Byrne and who's the very chiseled young man who's also in Baywatch again? Zac Efron.
Zac Efron.
Sorry, yes, sir. And it's got a big cast of a whole bunch of other people too. It's got McLovin. It's got Hannibal Buress in it. It's got a ton of people. It's got Ike Birkenhouse from Mindy Project and everything too. He's probably the one who steals the show in this film for me. But again, just a really stupid comedy that has no business kind of being very good. It's got this little Revenge of the Nerds type of feel to me in it as well, with the whole frat house kind of going kind of being the bullies and learning something at the end of the movie too. But Rogen and Efron have really good chemistry. Him and Rogen and Rose Byrne actually have really good chemistry too. So just and seeing her being funny is also kind of a joy to me, because everybody knows her from Bridesmaids, but I think this is probably the funnier role than Bridesmaids for me, for Rose Byrne. But it's a stupid little comedy, but it's my number 8 just because I am a 10-year-old at heart forever. I will never grow up and not be mad at dildo fighting or Garfield jokes or anything too. So that's me.
It's one of those. It's just like it's a true comedy through and through. Like it fits that definition perfectly. For me, I have it slotted at number 13. It was really close to making that list. I think along the same lines of maybe even 21 Jump Street and a couple other ones that I'm going to mention here in a bit that just are funny movies. Like they don't need to have more bells and whistles than that. It doesn't have to have anything else to see. There doesn't need to be any drama. Just make me laugh occasionally throughout a whole movie, and you got my money. So I agree. Neighbors was better than I thought it was going to be, and it actually had me excited when they had the sequel for once. Usually sequels don't excite me too much, but I was like, oh, let's see what else I do here. But so I agree. I think that's definitely worthy. Dan, any thoughts on Neighbors?
Yeah, again, it's very funny. I love the airbag gag that keeps recurring in that, and there's a pretty funny breast milk scene. There's a lot of really gross out funny humor within that, and I do feel like I wonder. I think when you watch that in college or compared to an adult, I think your perspective on it will definitely change, who you're more of you're rooting for. So being old obviously was always on Seth Rogen's side, but I did think it did a good job of kind of showing all those people had their faults and all of them had issues. I also even like the sequel. It wasn't necessarily as good because I do think that's a type of concept that's hard to replicate. Mm-hmm. But even trying it was funny and not nearly as good, but enjoyable nonetheless.
For sure. For my number 8, I already represented Wes Anderson with my number 9, so let me represent one of the other best comedic directors that we had during the whole decade at number 8. Give some love to Taika Waititi, and this one's going to be Hunt for the Wilder People, 2016 New Zealand comedy. I will watch anything that is New Zealand and comedy in the same sentence. I love their sense of humor, at least for the stuff that I have been exposed to, as far as Flight of the Conchords and everything else that Taika Waititi and Clement and et cetera have been involved with. This is like a breakout party for Julian Dennison. I haven't seen much of him. I've seen a little of him since this, but I just think it was a hilarious little tromp. Can't beat Sam Neill as the old curmudgeonly guy, and I just was very entertained by this. Taika Waititi hasn't made a bad film that I've seen, so Hunt for the Wilder People is my number 8. I think this was out in 2016, so this wouldn't have made any of the half-decade lists, but I think when we watched this, Amanda said that it was the funniest movie she had seen that year as well, so at least it got one person in my camp. Dan, thoughts on that, or what your number 8 is?
Yeah, I really thought about that too, because I wasn't I'll again, similar to Wes Anderson, also have a Taika Waititi film on my list. I won't reveal which one, but I will say the Hunter was one that people really thought about as well. But I wasn't sure if, like, again, was that more of a drama? I guess it's not really a drama, but I don't know. Sam Neill's fantastic. I can't think of the kid's name, but he's great as well. He really makes you like dislike him, but like in the best of ways. He's kind of like, he's not a great kid, but you get why, because he's in kind of a crappy situation. And so
it's Julian Dennison. He was in
He's
Deadpool 2 as well.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. He's I think much better. He's good in both, but I think he's much better in Hunt for Mortal People.
All right, what is your number 8?
Yeah, my number 8. Well, with comedy, we get a lot of bad romantic comedies. So when we get a good one, it's really exciting, and it's helpful when you get like great comedians making them. And I think that was the case with Big Sick. So that's my number 8 from 2017. Kumail Nanjiani telling the real life story of him and his wife, and kind of how they first met, and how shortly thereafter she ends up getting really sick and in a coma. And it gets into the awkwardness of their relationship, how they kind of broke up and separated, and ends up being a really weird situation. And on the flip side, he's also dealing with his own family, how they're trying to set up an arranged marriage, but they also thought how approached that was interesting as well, because it showed that something that I think in American culture we think it's kind of strange or weird. It showed why it makes sense and why it's maybe not that much more weird than what we do. And then also there's Ray Romano was, I think, fantastic. I was actually kind of disappointed he didn't get like more award love. He has one of my favorite lines of the decade when he's like talks about the internet. It's the thing I think about every time I see people angry at the internet about things that don't matter. Like internet hates everything. They even hate Forrest Gump. Like, who hates Forrest Gump? It's such a throwaway line, but it's very much a dad line. But I just find that really funny. And then obviously there's the 9/11 joke, which is probably the best joke of the entire movie, but I don't want to ruin it for those who may have not seen it. Although I doubt there's many people, because it is, available on Amazon, and it was also nominated for an Oscar for best screenplay, which is great to see, especially for a comedy. And so it's very fun. I guess not fun because it's depressing, I should say. You can maybe argue maybe it's more of a drama, but considering it's talking about comedy, Kumail Nanjiani's stand-up career is also involved within it as well. I considered it mostly a comedy, like within the romantic comedy genre. And like I said, we get so many rare good romantic comedies. I had it like once we got a good one, I wanted to include it. So
yeah, I agree. I think for some reason it's a complete oversight on mine, because I'm looking for where I have it ranked and I don't have it anywhere. But you're right, it should be up there because it is the rare good romantic comedy that seems to be a lost art these days. So I'm glad you had it on there because I completely spaced on that one. Matt, any thoughts on Big Sick, or what is your number 7?
No, solid pick. Big Sick. I really enjoy that film a lot. I think Zoe Kazan, this was like her breakout role too. So it was just a really, pulls at your heartstrings a little bit just enough, but is funny enough. It's I'll have probably some thoughts on that a little bit later too. But I'll move on to the next one. We are at number 7 now.
7. Yep.
Look at us go. So this is something that has already popped up in one of my other lists, but this is the perfect film where I'm able to cross it over to different genres of the list that we've already done. So I'm going 2010. I'm going with Scott Pilgrim versus the World. It's not only, I think it was really close to being my top comic book movie of the decade, but also it's number 7 on top comedies of the decade as well. It's just a perfect little film filled with so much color and fun and gleefulness and self-referential. That's not even a word, but it's being self-referencing everything. And I always love the gag with the Seinfeld gag in it as well too. It always brings kind of a smile to my face that they take the time to somehow work in some Seinfeld canned humor in there. I don't know why I liked it, but I love it. And it's a movie that I can just watch in awe of how beautiful it is, but then also take in all the tiny little weird quirks and funny little comic book nods they have. I mean, Milk and Eggs bitch is probably the line of the decade as well too. And overall, it's a great movie, but it's also great comedy as well. So
Yeah, you had this at number 3, I think, for your comic book film.
yes.
So obviously a big fan of this movie. I think a lot of people have it on their list too, and I did see this pop up on quite a few of the internet lists that we looked at in reference for this as well. So a lot of people in agreement there. For my number 7, I am going to go to another film that I saw a lot of comments on, and this is from 2016. It's listed as a neo-noir action comedy film. It's my second reference to a Ryan Gosling film, because this one is The Nice Guys with Ryan Gosling and Russell Crowe. I was in on this one straight from the trailers all the way through. Shane Black directed and wrote most of it, or at least wrote some of it. There's 2 people listed as writing credits, but big Shane Black involvement with this one. And I don't know. Again, this one might be a little bit too hard hitting or too actiony or too rough for it's not going to be like your family comedy film that you're going to watch. But as far as adults go, I think this is a good romp and a lot of funny bits as Russell Crowe, obviously plays the tough guy, and Ryan Gosling, maybe not quite as tough, but a different side of him. Who knew Ryan Gosling was so funny? But Nice Guys is my number 7. Dan, you're next.
Next, number 7. Yeah, I need to watch Nice Guys again. I feel like I watched it and I enjoyed it, but it didn't really click with me. I mean, I think I just probably had too high of expectations, because I do love Shane Black in most cases. My number 7 is probably one of my most decisive films, because I think a lot of people did not like this movie. But with a lot of Coen Brothers films, sometimes it takes time for people to appreciate them. Although I feel like it's been forgotten in a lot of ways, and that's Hail Caesar. Which is the Coen Brothers kind of taking on big Hollywood back in the studio days. And there's a lot of great moments in this. There's some there's, speaking of Channing Tatum, there's a great song and dance featuring him. I think George Clooney is really fantastic in this. I think he's an underrated comedic actor. One of my favorite comedic scenes in the entire decade was actually one that doesn't really get talked about. It was him sitting in a room with different religious figures talking about representing Jesus Christ in a movie, and just the back and forth dialogue in that was it was kind of slapstick but serious. It was really well written and really funny, and I think it just kind of gets lost in the shuffle a little bit because of they've had a lot of other films and it wasn't super successful. But I also really love that time frame. It's really interesting time frame, even though some really bad things were happening within the studio system. I think they play to that as well, because you have studios making these films that seem all clean cut and everything, but behind the scenes, some really bad things were happening. But I don't know. To me, it's a celebration of Hollywood, and also kind of the breakout for Han Solo, or young Han Solo. Yeah. Another really great sequence with Ralph Fiennes and the kind of pronouncing how to pronunciation, which is really funny as well. There's a lot of, maybe the through lines aren't as strong, because I think a lot of these scenes don't maybe connect as well, but I think separately they're really, really funny. And if you enjoy Coen Brothers humor and kind of that time period, it will click. So probably one of the more personal choices, but still, I really love this movie. So
I think you're right. It does get kind of lost in the shuffle, and I think it's deserving of a little bit more discussion and whatnot. And I think it's a fitting film for this list, because it did have a lot of pretty good comedic moments. So I think that's worth bringing up as well. Matt, what is your number 6?
All right. So it's a film we've already discussed. So my number 6 is 21 Jump Street. Just jumping right into the deep end there. Kind of already gone over what we kind of already liked about that film a lot. I ranked it a little bit higher than Dan, and higher. It didn't make your list, Kevin. I know it was
number 12
and everything too. So, but again, just singing the praises of it. It's again a film that shouldn't have been this good. But Hail Caesar. Just to go back to that real quick, I like the fact that it was so manic. And it was like almost so wacky in times. It was like an old Marx Brothers movie sometimes for that film. So I do like that pick, though. Dan, Hail Caesar was in my kind of thought process, but I was like, where would I place this if I was to place it like in a top 10? So Digress, number
I
7.
had a similar. I kind of compare Hail to Caesar, and even though it's probably more funny, to the same type of thought process I had with like something like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which I know some people didn't like it as much, and this, that, and the other. But for me, like that had a whole heck of a lot of comedic moments too. But I just couldn't land somewhere with it. So it's kind of the same reason why Hail Caesar didn't make my list. I just couldn't quite decide where I wanted to put it. For my number 6, I'm going to go all the way back to 2010. I'm sure I didn't have this ranked ahead of Crazy Stupid Love back then, but I do now. I think this one gets lost in the shuffle too. I don't know if it's because it came out the first year of the decade and we had 9 more years of movies coming afterwards, but when I think of like just kind of classic comedies of the era, I think this one deserves to be discussed. And I'm going with The Other Guys with Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg. If not just for the sequence of Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg sitting at the police desk and going through that whole speech about, how that didn't turn out how he thought it was going to, is the punchline basically. But I just think this was great. I think it was one of the more shocking cinematic experiences, and it's weird because it came in a comedy, but I mean, when you go to see this movie in the theater or wherever you saw it the first time, and there's some pretty shocking things that happen right away at the beginning, and you're like, wait, what's going on here? Okay, how is the rest of this movie going to go? And I won't say any more in case somebody out there hasn't seen it, but I think The Other Guys deserves more conversation. I mean, it's got a 70-something on Rotten Tomatoes, which isn't great, but it's not terrible. But I think it's got a lot of funny moments. I don't know why I haven't watched it more. This one's one that you would think you'd rewatch a few times, but it kind of reminds me of what it's almost like for me, it was almost like a changing of the guard between what we got for comedies like between 2000 and 2009. And The Other Guys maybe fits better in with that group than it does with the 2010 to 2019 group, because it reminds me of stuff like Step Brothers and stuff like Wedding Crashers and things like that. And so I don't know if that's why people don't talk about it, but The Other Guys I think is worthy. So I have that here at number 6 for me. Dan, thoughts on that or your number 6?
Well, my number 6, actually, why not both? Because my number 6 is also The Other Guys.
Excellent.
So, I agree. I think it's really fun. Again, another kind of spoof on the action genre. Really, I don't know if this is the movie that brought back Michael Keaton, but it certainly helped. Speaking of funny sequences, there's a great fight at a funeral that's all just done in whispers that he really nails. And I love how he always talks in TLC quotes for no apparent reason. It's just running gag. So there's a lot of that, and then Samuel L. Jackson and The Rock playing the iconic kind of buddy cop duo and what that leads to. There's a lot of randomness in this, a lot of things that don't but I think it works. And it hits that action genre comedy beat where it's both a good action film, because there's some good action. It's not fantastic, amazing action, but it's good enough. But it's also really, really funny. And so that's why I had it as my number 6.
Awesome. We're in agreement. So with that, I think it's a good time to take a quick break, play some ads here, and give you guys a chance to digest what we just threw at you with all our 10 through 6 picks. And when we come back, we'll give you our top 5 comedies of the last decade.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Hello, everyone. This is JD from the In Session Film Podcast. Each week, we review
the latest from Hollywood, California.
Well, yes, Brendan. We also
give top 3 lists.
Okay, yeah. Thanks again, Brendan. Additionally, you can hear us
talk other movie news, trailers, varying movie series, or other interesting film-related topics, and even rants and raves of the week.
On top of our main show, every Friday,
you can also hear our extra film podcasts.
You can listen to the In Session Film Podcast on
iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or at InSessionFilm.com. Listen to the In Session Film Podcast every Monday and Friday. Subscribe today and hear me verbally beat JD like a Cherokee drum.
No. That's not how this works, sir.
On the Simplistic Reviews podcast, we talk movies. We talk TV. We talk.
Hello, Julie, what the heck are you doing?
Trying to make our spots sound more exciting by adding explosions.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you could have got the point across with sound effects, not the real thing.
Download the show on iTunes or at simplisticreviews.blogspot.com.
I'm sure your insurance company will cover that.
No, they won't.
No, they probably won't.
All right, thanks for sticking with us. It's time for our top 5. Matt, start us out.
Whew, top 5 dead or alive. All right, so starting starting the top 5 here. This is the most, I guess, new release film, or the newest film on the list, at least for me. I'm not sure if this is going to end up on your guys' list or not, but I'm going with something that was also a Netflix original film. At least it went directly to Netflix, first of all. But and this was also kind of the talk of the resurgence of a certain actor as well too, after he was kind of really lost out in the wilderness for quite a long time. I'm going with Dolomite as my name. I think this film is like the perfect just idea of how hard it was to make movies in the 70s for any black director in a lot of ways, while also taking on this persona. And it just seems like watching this film, like Eddie Murphy was just made to play the Dolomite character, kind of similar to how he was in Harlem Nights with Red Fox and Richard Pryor and everything. It just seems like an amalgamation of all the films he's kind of ever made in that kind of pseudo genre of the 1920s, 1930s actors. He was playing in some roles, but Wesley Snipes is great in this film as well too. I think he gets kind of undercut and kind of forgotten about because he's equally as good as Eddie Murphy in this film, and it's just a over the top crazy romp, and it's Eddie Murphy being Eddie Murphy again. And this was the talk of like, oh, Eddie Murphy's finally back. It's like he's always been around, he just hasn't really been in great films or anything. 1,000 Words or Norbit or Pluto Nash or anything else you want to kind of ring off the list. Just sullied his persona and his credibility, I think, for a long time. But this was finally the return of the old school, filthy mouthed, I don't really care what I have to say type Eddie Murphy comedy. So it was to me, I loved it. I thought it was really fantastic.
This one's a blind spot for me, Dan. Have you seen this one?
No, I haven't. I tried, like, I started it like 8 times, and then I just ended up falling asleep because I'm old. But no, I tried to watch it before, like, we did our top 10s last year, and I just never got around to it. And then, despite the fact that we're, stuck indoors, I still have not seen it. But.
Yeah, I always have it in the queue, but I just have never clicked on it for some reason. But maybe I should now. I will consider that. For my number 5, I'm kind of going with the similar thing that Dan did on his other half of his list. He went with Paddington 2 as something that is kind of like that family fun comedy type situation. I'm going to do the same thing, and this was probably on my half-decade list, too. I don't have it in front of me, but I feel like I'm just regurgitating the whole list right now because this one's also back from 2011, and I'm going with not the sequel, but the original, I guess, reboot, whatever you want to call this. I'm going with The Muppets from 2011, the Jason Segel, etc. Joint, I guess is what you'd call it. But I don't know. I just found that this was like a reboot of the Muppets films, but then modernizing it, but also making it a little bit more of a comedy than I feel like. I'm not saying the Muppets weren't funny, like all the original movies. They do have funny elements, but this one I feel like was going out of its way to be funny. And I think most of it worked. There were some great songs. There's some great moments. There's some great cameos, et cetera, et cetera. So I found myself laughing quite a bit during this one. So I'm a big fan of the Muppets from 2011. Dan, your thoughts on the Muppets or your number 5?
Yeah, it was number 4 for you last year. So
there we go.
Fell down one spot 5 years later. So number 5, we talked about Taito Akihi with Hunt for Wilder People, and I also was going to include one of his films. I think for the last 3 years, one of his movies has made my top 10. I think it potentially started with this one. I can't think of the years of how it worked out, but the reason I chose this was because I feel like it's the most comedic out of all of his films. One that's like really mostly just a comedy, and that's What We Do in the Shadows, which apparently is also now a TV series, which I heard is really good as well, and I just have not watched it because there's a lot of things.
I couldn't get through the first episode.
Oh, give it another shot.
Okay,
you will not be disappointed.
Okay.
But this is again like talking about mockumentaries, which can be overdone, but I think when they're done well, it works. And this is a lot of really funny people being really funny, taking on the idea of vampires and also werewolves, not swearwolves, and it's just it can be a little bit scary as well. And actually, I think too, I loved how like the special effects within it kind of really felt old school in like old school Hollywood at the same time. So it's ridiculous, and I think it has these. The idea works. Sometimes that's what you need, and take the idea of like vampires living everyday lives, doing a mockumentary like you're doing like The Office but with vampires, and put it all together, get really funny people, and not only just yield a great movie, I guess also a great TV show, which I think got even Emmy nominated. It's kind of funny that that's getting more awards than a movie that it came from, but that's where we're at. So, but yeah, to me, it's one of the movies like just that I probably laughed at the most this past decade.
I agree, Matt. What is your number 4?
Well, my number 4 is what Dan was just talking about. My number 4 is What We Do in the Shadows.
Nice.
Just a really funny, dry New Zealand comedy, similar to all the Jermaine Clements and the Taika Waititi stuff. I mean, and I will argue that the show is funnier than the film, but I think it's also because it's a lot zanier, and that appeals to me. And plus, it has Matt Berry, and I love Matt Berry. And it's got all these fun, great little cameos from people too. That's why I implore you, Kev, to go back to the TV show. And it is a little bit of it's a jarring show that it's so dry and so earnest sometimes with the way that they follow vampire life, and it's also completely off the wall, like I said before, and it also incorporates like a whole different kind of really interesting plot device that works really well in the show, compared to what they do in the film. The film has its own kind of plot devices that work really well too, but it's funny, and seeing the show now makes me appreciate the film even more. That's probably why it ended up this high on my list, probably with the help of the show, is using that as a compendium to elevate the material that this movie already put out. So that's my number 4, What We Do in the Shadows.
Excellent. I like the agreement. For my number 4, I'm going with my second cheat. I know we already had a whole countdown about superhero or comic book films, but I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't give them at least a shout out during this countdown. My problem is I can't decide which one. But I think there's been a lot of humor that has been instilled into some of these comic book films, and they've done a really nice job with it. So this is like a trio for me. I don't know which way to go. It's my placeholder for either Deadpool, Thor Ragnarok, which is also a Taika Waititi film, or Guardians of the Galaxy. I think these 3 films represent for me what is the funniest out of the comic book or superhero genre. And they all do it in a little different way, so I just couldn't quite separate it. I mean, we have Thor Ragnarok from Waititi, we have Guardians of the Galaxy, which I think was the original one that kind of just blew us away with how funny that was. But Deadpool might be the most straight comedy of them all. Maybe one could make an argument for, if I was really being true, I should put Guardians of the Galaxy 2, because that has the single moment that I've laughed the loudest in the theater in the last decade with Mary Poppins, y'all. I've never laughed that loud in a theater. I'm usually a very quiet person when it comes to laughing. Like, I do it mostly on the inside, and this one I lost my mind on. So, but I just think, the superhero genre has done a good job with adding comedic moments, especially in the MCU. And I think these 3 films kind of stand out for me when I'm looking back at some of the funniest things that I've seen in the theater. I don't know which one you guys would go with, or if any of these made your list, but I guess it's my placeholder for superhero comedies with Deadpool, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Thor Ragnarok. Dan, is that allowed?
I guess so. I mean, I didn't include. I just cheated and said, since we did best comic book films or superhero films, I didn't include any superhero films. But if I was going to choose which one I thought was the funniest out of those, I mean, I would probably say Deadpool is probably the funniest, where I think Ragnarok might be the best movie out of them. I don't know. But, for my number 4, I'm going with, I realizing I didn't do this on purpose, but now I'm seeing the numbers line up, and I guess it makes sense. Going with 4 Lions, which is a British comedy, which I have a lot of on my list. But very different than something like Paddington. It's kind of a very subversive comedy, which I could see not working for a lot of people, because it's about British jihadists and their life living in the United Kingdom, trying to kind of live through taking shortly, after 9/11. It's kind of their life story in a way. It's not mockumentary style, but it's not that far off. But they're kind of bumbling idiots. and they're not very good at what they're trying to accomplish. And it's very risky, but there's also a lot of like slapstick humor in it as well. Like there's a sequence in which they're afraid that they're going to get their faces photographed, so to try to avoid it, they just keep moving their heads back and forth really fast, as if like they're the Flash or something like that. And it's just, I think, kind of going. I think the best type of comedy tends to be that goes after that taboo, and it doesn't hold back. And I think that's exactly the case with Four Lions. It's not like trying to be subversive for subversive sake, or just trying to like, hey, look at me, I'm being risque or whatnot. It has something to say. It's smart, but also kind of silly at the same time, which is again what makes it even more subversive. And there's just some really great comedic performances in it as well. So again, it's one that it came out in 2010, so it's really early in the decade. It was high on my list then, and I still think it's one of the more impactful comedies I've seen in the last 10 years.
Another blind spot for me, so I will have to add it to the list. Matt, have you seen this one?
Nope, blind spot for me as well. I know that Riz Ahmed is in it, and I guess this is probably one of his breakout roles, I would assume, for him. But yeah, this is a blind spot for me. I haven't seen it. Actually, had not heard of it until I did a little searching for it as Dan was talking. But it seems I like a good subversive comedy that kind of flip some expectation. I feel like we've gone with kind of like top to bottom pretty from family friendly to straight up comedies, but I like how Dan's kind of adding a little flair to the proceedings. Well done, Dan.
All right, then that brings us to your next pick. Dan always brings flair to the recordings, for the record. So
full of flair.
All right, you're number 3, sir.
All right, so going back to the early part of the decade for this one, and this one was something I think when it came out just really didn't have a lot of interest in it. I thought it was just kind of I don't know. There was something about it that just didn't really stick with me, that get in my soul that I want to watch it. But once I watched it, oh boy, it's probably a movie I go back to every year because it kind of incorporates everything I like about buddy comedies, kind of nerddom, geekdom as a whole, sci-fi, kind of everything. And plus, it's got I have to have some sort of Edgar Wright-ish type element in here, even though this isn't directed by Edgar Wright. This is directed by Greg Mottola, who's done some other great stuff. But I'm going with 2011's Paul. This movie's a ton of fun. It's a road film with Nick Frost and Edgar Wright. It's got Kristen Wiig. It's got a murderer's row of everybody who was hot anywhere between 2008 and 2015, I'd say 2016, shows up in this film, and it's got really good heart to it. It has all the kind of famous conspiracy theory stuff that conspiracy theory people would love to kind of hear about aliens. Seth Rogen plays the alien voice. He does a great job, and it's got that ET vibe. It's got that everything about it just kind of comes together, and in the end is very this is probably the most I don't want to say heartwarming, but probably the okay, you might shed a little tear in this, because this definitely has some good some good qualities to it. It's a fun film, good buddy film, shows some good friendship to it, and I think it's an underseen film. I don't think a lot of people have probably either gone back and seen this or seen it at all. So I'm going with Paul at number 3 for me.
I have another blind spot. I got to get to work, guys. You guys are giving me a whole list of stuff to see. Hey, Dan, have you seen this one?
I have. I did really like Paul. It one of the few comedies that happened last decade that had a capturing the Freeman joke, so that gives it extra points. So
excellent. All right, for my number 3, I'm going to go with the one that is the most recent one on my list. Is from 2019. I talked about it in our best of the year list. And I guess maybe as much as I'm a sucker for Ryan Gosling and Taika Waititi and Wes Anderson, I'm also a sucker for Bill Murray. And this would be The Dead Don't Die. I laughed my butt off with this one. I think the combination of Bill Murray, Adam Driver, and Chloe, I'm never going to say her name right in my lifetime. That's her last name. And you have everybody. You got Steve Buscemi, you got Tilda Swinton, Danny Glover. I mean, this movie was hilarious. I enjoyed the political humor. I believe I enjoyed the timeliness of it. I enjoyed the wackiness of it. I think this hit on so many different levels. I have not seen a ton of Jim Jarmusch films, so I can't say if I'm a fan of all of his work, but this film alone makes me want to watch some of his other stuff, which again is on a list of stuff I have to do. But with a 4-month-old, I'm watching a lot of Trolls World Tour, so that is what I'm doing right now with my life. So but I remember once upon a time when I was watching movies like this, and The Dead Don't Die is one that I thoroughly enjoyed. Dan, thoughts on that, or your number 3?
I've not seen it, so I can again talking about blind spots. That is one for me. My number 3.
I get to give you a blind spot.
I know.
Touche.
I noticed I have many more blind spots in the second half of this decade than I did the first half. I'm not sure what happened, but mostly life. My number 3, again, talking about British comedy, another British comedy that is also tied to a TV show, because technically in the UK, I believe it came out as a television series, where in the US it came out as a movie or 3 separate films, and that's The Trip from 2010. There's I think 3 films within the sequel, within this franchise, if you want to call it that, and I guess you can include all of them. If I were just going to pick one, I'd probably say the first one, although I think they all have their moments and they're all quite good, and especially because comedy sequels are super rare when it comes to being good. Usually they're pretty awful, but The Trip, it works, I think, because the premise of The Trip is one that you can repeat without it feeling forced. It's literally that, 2 people going on a trip. Again, Steve Coogan, and I think this probably became pretty famous, or at least like the viral moment of this movie was the classic Sean Connery off, which is fitting considering he passed away. No, Michael Keaton, not Sean Connery. What was I thinking? But doing the Michael Keaton impressions, and you do get a lot of that from Coogan and Rob Brydon. But I think it also gets to me just like it's really ultimately about their life. And these 2 men just trying to figure out, they're at 2 very different spots. Coogan starts off with it more kind of career focus. His family life is kind of falling apart a little bit. Rob Brydon is probably not as big of a star, but his life, I think, is a little bit more secure. And it goes down some really weird and strange by the second, third film. It goes into some unexpected territory. But they're just really great with one another. And also, it is basically food porn too. Like as they go all to these different restaurants, and it just opens the door for funny people to be funny, and that's typically the best type of comedy. So I know it may not work for a lot of people because it can get kind of repetitive if you're not into people doing impressions or you don't enjoy this type of humor. It may seem kind of dull, but I've enjoyed it. I enjoyed each one, and I think I'm very tempted to watch the series, considering. But for now, I'm just going to enjoy the films.
Matt, have you seen this one?
No, these are all 3 of these. I guess you can almost consider 4 movies, because you have the trip to Spain, trip to Italy, and I guess you just recently had the trip to Greece just came out recently. And
yeah.
So all these are all in my blind spots, but I know everybody raves about them and how funny Brydon and Coogan are in the film. This is kind of like another. I almost kind of consider like this trio of films like a blind spot, as I also consider the trio of films like the Before series and everything is like blind spots on the drama side. So this is like my trio of comedy blind spots, as the Before movies are my blind spots on drama movies. So maybe one day they will all collide and I'll just watch like 8 movies in a row consisting of nothing but the Before series and the Trip series or something. So I have work to do. So much.
Yeah, I like to make for good discussion too, so that's a blind spot for me as well. So sorry, I'm doing a terrible job of bouncing off of you guys with some of these films. I need to watch more comedies. And Dan's been singing the praise of this one for a long time, and it's always been on my list because of that, and I just haven't got to it. So I need to stop making excuses and watch all of these films. It's a blind spot in the same way that is it a trilogy that Simon Pegg has, or how many films are considered in that group with
I'd say 3 with Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz and World's End. Yes.
Yeah, I haven't seen all of those either, and I need to. So, all right, Matt, we are rounding it down to the nitty gritty here. What do you got at your number 2?
Well, okay. Well, we already spoke about this film much earlier in the podcast, but my number two is just to not have any suspense to this. The Big Sick is my number two for this. One, I think this film, and I'm also kind of sort of an apologist for funny people as well too. I don't think a lot of people. I think people either loved or hated that film with Seth Rogen and Adam Sandler. It's like, oh, it was like another just Apatow masturbation fest with comedians and stuff. But I think there's a lot of allusions. Plus, there's the Ray Romano connection in both these films. I mean, he's not playing the same character, but Ray Romano is in both. But I like the idea of letting funny people just be funny. I think there's something kind of sincere about letting them just cut loose, but also telling a very personal story in the film as well. And I really love Zoe Kazan in this. I think it's a very just you don't get performances like this in kind of like people might say this like, oh, just another rom-com, but I think there's something a lot more kind of going in it. It's the same way I kind of feel about the movie 50-50 as well too, which was very close to making this list. To be able to turn cancer into something kind of funny and not in a funny way, but to kind of persevere through it through comedy, I think is it could come off as cheesy, but I think they play this film earnest and funny enough to not make you go like, oh god, another one of these movies where boy meets girl, boy almost loses girl, yada yada yada. But it's just a really great film overall that surprised me because this was gonna be rom-com, not into it, but and ends up being super high on my list at my number two spot.
Yeah, you mentioned 50-50, so I'll piggyback off of that. I just couldn't quite put it on my list because I think it is funny, but I don't necessarily think of it as 100% comedy. So it's kind of one that I was not quite sure how to. But that was my number one film of the year it came out, and then since then I have convinced nobody to watch that with me.
Oh, I love it. I love that movie.
I cannot get anybody to watch that film with me because they think it's just going to be depressing and sad. And I'm like, no, it's a really good film. But so I will always be singing its praises because I love 50-50. And obviously we're in agreement on Big Sick. It didn't quite make my list because I had a spaced out moment, but it was on Dan's list and your list. So obviously worthy of being talked about with comedies of this last decade. Or my number two, it's already been talked about by both of you guys, so I won't spend too much time on it. My number two is What We Do in the Shadows. It was my number one comedy that year. It was one of my top 10 films that year. It's why we were so excited for the series when it came out. This was by far Amanda's number one film, I believe, or at least number one comedy for a long time. She was obsessed with this movie in a good way, and we will have to give the series another chance. We just tried to watch it the first episode late at night, and I think we just weren't in the right mindset for it. But What We Do in the Shadows was just so great. It was so unique. It was something that we hadn't seen a lot of, or there wasn't really anything to compare it to at that exact moment. So I just think it worked on all facets, and I'm glad it did because we've gotten a lot more of Taika Waititi since then. So Dan, what's your number two?
My number two was one that I actually had in my best comic book movie list. It's not a superhero comedy, but it's The Death of Stalin, based upon the graphic novel and obviously real life death of Stalin. This is directed by Armando Iannucci, who, one of the great political satirists of our time currently. Things like Veep, which was a hilarious television show, or In the Loop, another film which was also nominated for best screenplay. And then he kind of takes that and brings it into The Death of Stalin, which is a movie about what happened in the Soviet Union right after the death of the surprising death of Stalin and what occurred. There is some pretty dark pieces in this because it is dealing with that time frame where a lot of horrible things happened. A lot of people were killed, but also has a lot of very funny moments as well, with kind of the type of actors that you would see in a lot of his work. And I love the choice too of like not trying to get the actors to do Russian accents. They just talk like they normally would, which I think is the right choice because I think it makes the comedy play a lot better. People like Steve Buscemi, who might give the performance of the entire film. He's great in it. But I would highly recommend it, especially if you like some of those things I mentioned, like Veep um, or in the Loop, anything of that nature. It would really work well with you because it's the same type of sensibilities, just done in not through the spectrum of like the United States or UK politics, but that of the Soviet Union, like right as not near the collapse of the Soviet Union, but in a very treacherous time. And I also recommend reading the comic because it's really good too. So the comic isn't probably as comedic, I would say, as the movie. But.
This is another blind spot for me. It's one that I also have had high on my list because of what I've heard you say about it, but I still need to get around to watching it. Matt, have you seen it?
No, this is another kind of blind spot. I mean,
we're doing a terrible job of discussing these
movies. It taunts me all the time. I think it's on Amazon Prime, and it's always like, "Hey, you'll really like this. All these other movies you've been watching, something that's in your wheelhouse." I'm like, all right, I'll get to it. I promise I will. Same thing as like Hunt for the Wilder People that we talked. It's been in my Hulu save list, I would say, for the better part of a year at this point as well. So definitely a lot of blind spots. But Death of Stalin, I think the trigger will be pulled on that.
Excellent. No pun intended.
Soon. Yes, not at all.
All right, that brings us to the coveted number 1 spot. We'll see if we have anything in common or if we have any blind spots here as well. Matt, start us off.
All right, so this is, and again, I mean, all these films, most of these films, I'd say about 80% of them at this point are films I like to watch with my wife Nicole, and they're just, this one to me is like the ultimate comfort food for me in so many respects. It's just pure, unadulterated. Kind of like it's almost perfect having Big Sick at number 2 than having this at number 1 because it's just a bunch of funny people being funny for 2 hours. And you know, the way 2020 has been going, you know, you probably think, you know, what's going to happen come the end of this year? You don't really know. Could what's happening in this film that I'm about to? I'm really bearing the lead here, by the way. Could this happen, and would this be better for me to have this happen than have the rest of the year? I'm getting really existential, so I'll shut up and just tell you the movie. So it's from 2013, and it's the ultimate Judd Apatow buddy fest, and it's This Is the End is my number 1 comedy of the entire decade. It's something I can turn on or watch at any point in the film and just know exactly what has happened, what's going to happen, what's going on. And it's, again, just I use the term again, it's a murderer's row of anybody. Literally in the first 20 minutes, it's probably every comedian that has had a Netflix special or has been in a movie or done this or done that. And it's just funny people being really funny and full of inside jokes. And if you follow the other actors' careers, they're talking about things that they've been in, so you kind of get a chuckle about that. And it has the surprise cameos from people who just show up. I feel like they just said, somebody got on the phone and said, "Hey, can everybody just come by and do something really silly and stupid for this film?" So, and it has one of probably the best endings out of all the films we talked about. Where I don't want to spoil it. It's only 7 years old, so I won't. But if you haven't seen This Is the End, do yourself a favor. Again, this might be just my bias of loving this film. I'm sure maybe it was funnier a long time ago, but I feel like this film is just as funny as it was when I saw it 7 years ago, laughing my ass off in the theater along with everybody else back in 2013. So This Is the End is my numero uno.
It was pretty well represented on the list that we looked at too. It was on like 4 or 5 of the top lists that were out there. I thought this was funny. It had some scenes that I never want to see again, but it was it was definitely a funny film. Dan, have you seen this one?
Yeah, I did. I thought about it. It made a lot of our lists or it made Amanda's list and Barry's list when we did the half decade. And I was close to that. Also, The World's End also almost included. It is straight up really one of the, I think, purest, funniest films of the year. Also love the ending. Like, I was wondering, like, how are they going to end this? And I thought they nailed that, which was going to be quite hard considering how crazy it is. But yeah, I agree with it. As was stated, it might actually become a little bit more prophetic as we look up in the weeks to come. So who knows?
For my number one, kind of unexpected. I wouldn't have, if you would have asked me, most of the decade what my number one was, it probably would have been What We Do in the Shadows, or, obviously Crazy Stupid Love at one point held that spot. But this one, I put it here because for me, it just fits. Like, if you want the perfect example of what people think about when you think about comedy, I think this one works, as it's not partly this or partly that. Is 100% comedy, and it was funnier than I thought it even would be. I saw this with a group of people, and every single one of them was enjoying themselves. Every one of them thought it was funny. I didn't have any detractors amongst the group, and so for that reason, I'm going to stick with it. I think it was a good concept. I think it was well executed. I think it has a lot of moments that people remember from it. And I don't know. It worked for me as a comedy. And that's 2018. And that is the film Game Night.
Oh, wow.
I just think for some reason, like this one, like when you were talking about like just bring a bunch of funny people and have them do funny things. Like, to me, that's kind of what happened in this film. And maybe not as many, like, I don't know, maybe the people that you would think of as funny people aren't necessarily these people, but I think they all have, comedic elements to what they do. So I think when they brought them all together, it worked pretty well. And Jason Bateman does comedy pretty well. This is the funniest I've ever seen Rachel McAdams. And Jesse Plemons, I think he made, I don't know if he made memes out of this or if it was just like a thing, but like he became very in the know for what his role was in this film. And it was just kind of a crazy character that he played. But I just thought it was a lot of fun. So if we're going with something that's just like general fun for me and that is enjoyable, like this is the type of film that I think of. Like maybe it kind of goes more hand in hand with like The Other Guys a little bit, or some films that just didn't quite make my list, or like a Neighbors or something like that. But I think through and through, this is a comedy, and I think it worked very well. So I went with Game Night with my number one. It's kind of a surprise pick even to me. Matt, have you seen this one?
Oh, yeah. I saw this when it finally hit on HBO and everything. And I remember enjoying this movie a lot. It's got that fun kind of whodunit type thing going on. Not even whodunit, but there's just some really fun, weird hijinks and wackiness. And even up until the very end, it's everybody's kind of, pranking each other and doing weird things, and you're not sure. It definitely messes it subverts your expectations in a lot of ways where you don't really know what's happening, which is kind of fun to see a movie like that where it's funny, but it's also what's really going on. I mean, it might be kind of punked around with and everything and joked around with, and Jason Bateman and Rachel McAdams do a good 1-2 punch, and I like the guy from New Girl, Lamar Morris. I think he's really great. I really like him a lot. He was great, and this is off topic. He was great in the show Woke that was on Hulu this year as well too. But everybody in this film really brings their A game. It does a good job. I'm just surprised you had it so high, Kevin.
Yeah, Dan, your thoughts on it, and what's your number one?
Yeah, I like Game Night a lot. I think it was a huge surprise when that came out. When that it seemed like this could be fun, and it ended up being quite funny. Again, Jason Bateman's fantastic, and I think you mentioned Jesse Plemons, and that is just, man, he he makes that movie. Like his character is just so ultra creepy, but I don't know. I don't know if that movie it's nearly the same. And then there's a perhaps one of the best moment. I'm not going to ruin it, but it's just Rachel McAdams reacting to someone being killed was just the timing of that was fantastic. My number one is actually, oddly enough, was my number one at the last time we did this, and it may not be the movie I laughed at the most, if I was being honest. If just straight, comedy, if laugh a minute, it may not be this, but I think it's probably the best made film out of all mine on my list, and that's The Grand Budapest Hotel, one that's already been mentioned by Kevin. It's just such a well-crafted film, and Ray Fiennes, where most of the comedy comes from is him and playing this like well-defined, like trying to be proper character that clearly is not that type of person. And when he lets it slip, it's hilarious. And just like his random cursing, again, a lot of great gags. The prison escape is really fun, and it's almost like a Looney Tunes-esque and some of those beats. But there's also this underlying seriousness of it when you realize what it's really talking about. So again, maybe some would argue this isn't necessarily a pure comedy, but I think ultimately I think that's what it's best at is often it's comedy. And it never stops being funny, even when some of the more serious things happen. It'll at least kind of cap those off with a joke. I know Wes Anderson's not for everyone. Some people, like, if you don't like him, you're pretty much, if you don't like one of his movies, you're not going to like any of them. I do think The Grand Budapest Hotel might be, in my opinion, his best movie. It's up there. I don't know. It's also got a great soundtrack, but that's a great score. But that's beyond the point. So again, and not what I expected as my number one. If you told me like just to name my best comedy of the decade off the top of my head, it wouldn't necessarily be The Grand Budapest Hotel. But if I was doing everything, if I was considering everything, and just looking at best made films, it is the one that stood out the most to me. With everything else that came out last decade.
Nice. Obviously, I agree. Since I mentioned it with Moonrise Kingdom as well, I need to watch them both back to back to really decide which one I like better. But I think they're both really well made films and both very funny films. And I think it's very apropos that Wes Anderson gets represented, especially at the top of one of our lists. If we were looking at the top of all of these different lists that we looked at, Film School Rejects had What We Do in the Shadows as number one. Rotten Tomatoes list Booksmart as number one. Collider list MacGruber, Paste, What We Do in the Shadows, World of Real, Nice Guys, Head Stuff, Paddington, Slash Film, What We Do in the Shadows, Taste of Cinema, The World's End, and Screen Rant, What We Do in the Shadows. So those are who reign supreme on all of those lists. Matt, any honorable mentions or something that didn't quite make your list or that you wanted to throw out there?
Yeah, there were a few, and I hesitate. I'm glad none of us kind of fell into the trap of, things that were maybe had really, really funny moments. I think we all had, films that could all be considered very much so like comedies in a true form in some way or another. So, but just a few that came to my mind that didn't quite make the list. Frank from 2014 was up there, which is probably the most oddball comedy that I really like. Just Michael Fassbender in a giant mask as a musician is just perfect to me, and it's so it's tender, but it's funny, and it's just off the wall, and it's very surreal. So I like that film a lot. I would also say Bad Milo, which is kind of like a little bit of a deep cut, but any film that has like a monster living in somebody's like ass definitely gets high marks from me. And I'd probably also say I'd say Get Him to the Greek, again, another Apatow film in that ilk. But I think Get Him to the Greek, since it came out back in 2010. A lot of people forgot about that, but that actually has a very unintentionally funny performance by Sean Combs, P. Diddy. So I think he stole the show in a lot of forms in that film. So there's a few others, but those are just kind of a few that just kind of they were close to the list, but they just didn't quite get over the hump for me.
Yeah, for me, we already mentioned a couple of them because they were on your list with 21 Jump Street and Neighbors. The other ones that were probably the closest that didn't quite make it was Date Night. I think Date Night's really funny. Maybe I'm just a Steve Carell fan, but that's another one that I like showing to people. But I thought it was maybe too much of a personal choice, so I left it off just barely. Bad Words, I think, had some pretty funny moments. We Are the Millers was better than I thought it was going to be. I have like The Way, Way Back listed. Ted was okay. I just didn't think it quite was on the same level of the ones we were talking about. So those were some of the ones that I had listed as honorable mentions. Dan, what about you?
Some other ones that I did mention The World's End. I do really like that. I know a lot of people don't put it on the same level as like the other parts of that trilogy, but I think it's really, again, somewhat underrated. Midnight in Paris, I think, is a really funny film. Probably. You could argue maybe more, again, another really good romantic comedy. A movie I really wanted to find a place for it, but I just couldn't, with Cedar Rapids with Ed Helms. to me, this was like to Edward Helms like coming out party when it came into film, and him kind of just going on this adventure, this retreat, and he's just such a genuinely good person within this movie, which is rare, especially for comedies. Easy A is another one. Again, another like kind of classic high school comedy. Probably one of the better of the decade. Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Really good spoof comedy about the horror genre, which ended up being really smart. Seven Psychopaths, which is a great Christopher Walken performance. Bridesmaids, which is probably one of them I'm surprised didn't get mentioned yet. One of the bigger, films of the last decade. Kind of gave us Wilson McCarthy, so I know, Amanda's probably a big fan of it, considering. But yeah, there's a lot else out there. I don't know if you wanted me to go over what was anything else.
Yeah, any highlights from the half-decade list that didn't make our list?
So I think other movies that were on your list then that didn't make them, The Way Back wasn't mentioned. That was your number 9. Everything else that was there was pretty much, you mentioned Ted. Ted was on your list then. Moonrise Kingdom. And everything else. Other things, I mentioned everything else that was not mentioned. Some of them on Amanda's list that weren't mentioned from the half-decade list were Tammy, St. Vincent, Dark Shadows, The Family, We're the Millers, The Heat, were all on her half-decade list. So, but yeah.
Excellent. I was not surprised that there was a few Melissa McCarthy films on her list, and some Sandra Bullock films. That doesn't surprise me. I'm just glad nobody had MacGruber on their list. I know I shouldn't say anything about that. I haven't seen the film. I'm somewhat against the idea of MacGruber because I was such a big MacGyver fan, and I can't look at it in a spoofy comedy way because I'm just.
I've never seen it, so I can't speak to it. So.
The other film that I wanted to throw out there that I saw on a lot of the list because it was like on number 2, 3, 4 on some of these lists was Pop Star Never Stopping. Is that the right word? I don't know if I said the title right, but the Pop Star movie,
or whatever it is.
Yeah, that was on a lot of the list that I looked at as far as being pretty high. And I thought that was a good movie, but I just didn't quite have it on the same level like we talked about with some of these other films. But it's an interesting genre to discuss. Matt, how do you feel like, and just kind of like a closing thought, how do you feel like the decade was for comedy? And I feel like when you look back at different decades, like comedy has a different feel. Like, a comedy from the 80s is a completely different thing than a comedy from the 90s, et cetera. Do we have a definition of like comedies from the 2010s? Was there an identity there?
It's weird because I think that the 2010s and I guess the late 00s, they were definitely kind of dominated by just Judd Apatow in his films, and you kind of see that all the way up until. You still see it up till now, but I think there was definitely kind of a line of demarcation where you had all the people that were from that camp and that troupe of comedy people that kind of sort of stopped at about I'd say the mid 2010s, about 2015, 2016. You still had some influence in there, but it wasn't as heavy as it was in the early part of the decade. And then you started getting a lot more kind of things like the trip films. You started getting a lot of these kind of import, kind of like European influenced comedies and things like that, or Death of Stalin, which Dan talked about. So it was kind of a mixed bag. And one more thing I'd like to mention, I forgot to mention, is the Spy That Dumped Me. I feel like that was a really overlooked film, sadly, and it ended up being very, very, very funny. Sorry, I digress. But
no, that's good. That's good.
And it's just one of these things where, it's been when you have so many films in a genre, it's hard to really define it. But I think if anything, the defining thing was just the ongoing and lasting impact of just Judd Apatow as well too. That's what I really have to say about the decade as a whole.
Dan, kind of as your closing thoughts, the same type of thing, but a little different. Like when we look back at the 80s, we think of, people like Bill Murray, Chevy Chase, Steve Martin, John Candy. When we look at the 90s, we're probably looking at like Mike Myers, Adam Sandler, Jim Carrey, things of that nature. Who are the comedians of the 2010s when it comes to the film world?
I think Jason Bateman is one that comes to mind. Like he was in a lot. We talked about Game Night. And a few others, and I think too what's going to be interesting with this past decade is just like how much like comedy and drama, like movies and TV have kind of combined since we're in this weird time frame where with streaming and everything like that. I also think Channing Tatum, like he kind of proved himself to be a comedic actor, and he gained a lot of respect because of things like the 21 Jump Street films, where people weren't expecting him to be nearly as funny as he was. Even Mark Wahlberg, like his roles in something like The Other Guys, and sometimes unintentionally funny, like with Transformers. But what are you gonna do? But then I think too, maybe the story will be more so maybe the directors of looking at like something like Tata. I can't see his name. I used to be able to say it. I don't know what happened, but like this was kind of his coming out party this decade. He went from something like What We Do in the Shadows, The Hunt for Wilder People, to making Marvel films and things like that. But then also getting his prestige movie with getting nominated for Best Picture. So I think if you look at, as Judd Apatow was leaving, he kind of came in, and his films probably weren't as financially successful per se, but I do think he grew a lot as being like a strong voice as in the comedic realm. But yeah, I don't know if we have like that new
maybe like a on the female side, like obviously we had Melissa McCarthy, we had like maybe Kate McKinnon, Amy Poehler, or Amy Schumer.
Amy Schumer. Yeah.
I don't know, like Seth Rogen maybe.
I would say Emma Stone. I mean, she was in a lot. I think that her work in Easy A for this is the end, but Crazy Stupid Love. Even in she did a lot of. She was in I can't think of whatever Woody.
Yeah,
I can't think of the Cafe Society. I don't know, but she really grew as an actress, and a lot of that was her comedic role. I mean, even in like La La Land, she had a lot of great comedic bits. So I would, in Rose Byrne, she broke out too. She broke out with The Bridesmaids and talking about Neighbors and things like that. I think she was another one as well. She became a really bigger name this past decade, and she's done more than comedy. She's been in X-Men films and things like that too.
Right.
But on that side, so
yeah, I would be interested to have the listeners kind of chime in too on who they think are the most prevalent comedic actors or actresses of that last decade, and kind of who you think of when you think of that decade worth of comedic films. It'd be interesting to see what other names get thrown out there for sure. Hopefully we gave you guys a sampling of some films that you either enjoyed over the course of the last decade, or like we did to each other, maybe we gave you guys a laundry list of things that you need to watch if you enjoy comedic films. So hopefully we represented a vast array of different tastes and different comedic comedic taste, I guess, for the main part, because we all have kind of a different thing that we gravitate toward that we find funny, and hopefully we represented a little bit of all of that here. We had, like Matt talked about, with some European flavor, we had some New Zealand flavor, so we're trying to represent the globe here. But that does it for this episode. Matt, if people want to hear more of your thoughts, as well as your sidekicks, your two sidekicks thoughts, what can they do to check out more of your stuff?
Yeah, head on over as per normal to, we used to tell people to go to simplisticreviews.net. We don't tell people to do that anymore. It takes too much time. You just go simplistic.reviews, go right to the website. That's where all the funny, all the good stuff is found. All the podcasts, all the reviews, all the lists of everything that we're doing. Podcast, commentary podcasts, and regular podcasts are released on the 1st and 15th of every month. So you get to hear us twice a month on a consistent basis.
Highly recommend.
As if the world was not falling apart enough. Now you can listen to us twice a month, and it's so grand. And you could even relive our 12 hours of madness as we were watching horror films for October. 12 hours of us talking about 8 different horror movies and slowly growing insane. You can now download those films. We won't tell you what it is. Go to simplistic.reviews, and you will find everything you will need to know about us and more.
Sounds like a good way to spend any time if you're still quarantined or doing anything like that.
Oh, boy.
Definitely check out some of that. Dan, anything that you have coming down the pipe, or any written content that you want to highlight, or things that you're doing?
Sure, yeah. So doing some more with not a lot of movies coming out. I've been focusing most on comic books, and I've been doing some weekly articles on GeekCast Radio, doing my favorite comic covers of the week, my favorite comic book panels, and my favorite top 10 comics of each week. And then shortly thereafter, probably in the next month or two, beginning of December, I'll be doing my yearly top 100 comic book list. So that check that out. I usually try to drop it within the first 2 weeks of December. So I just have a lot of reading to do, hopefully, before then.
Absolutely. And obviously you can go back in the archives there and check out our other top 10 movie lists of the decades, as we've been doing a few of those, and hopefully we'll have at least one or two more things to put out before the end of the year. But that does it for this episode of the Cinema Geek. So tune in next time for another chance to listen to more Cinema Geeks.